of here now. I'm glad to be here. It was really interesting. Before, this is the first time I've seen the film, and sitting down, sort of just jotting down some basic thoughts and ideas about the kinds of issues or the kinds of questions this issue raises. I was very pleased to see a lot of them brought up directly and explicitly in the film. It seems to me, we have a real challenge in terms of what's the role of technology in how we shape our lives and how we organize ourselves and how we, provide for ourselves as a community, as a society, things that we want, things that we like. And in the U.S. in particular, we've had a long love affair with technology, and sort of anything tech is good. And just look at the lionization of technology in Silicon Valley right now, which I still prefer to call Santa Clara Valley, but I'm one of the few people around maybe who even remembers that's its name. Nevertheless, technology raises quite a number of issues, and they often fall into sort of two categories that often are in tension with each other. One is just a scientific and technological question: what works, what doesn't work, and how, what is the best way, or how, what are the ways that we, with our ingenuity, our human ingenuity, our capacity to reason, can come up with strategies for dealing with the challenges that we face in any number of walks of life. But that always runs into an intention with, for lack of a better phrase, public policy kinds of questions, and more broadly, sort of the political decision-making as to what technologies do we want and to do what with them. One of the issues with GMO technologies in agriculture, which is something I'm far more familiar with than with this particular case, is the role of GMOs and how it currently supports a very particular model of agricultural production tied to very large-scale land holdings, capital intensive. Is very much tied to a food system like fast food and all the rest. So it's not a trivial question to use GMOs if all of the institutional infrastructure is biased in one direction, right? So it's not open to a broader debate of what kind of society do we want? How are these technologies, how is this skill that we have being used to shape the kinds of social lives, the kinds of political organizations we want to have? And so what I was really pleased with in seeing this movie is that it put that public policy question front and center, that one of the primary initial concerns is, and how are these decisions being made? And who has a right to have a voice in this? Where that runs into the science and technology problem is that, the scientists know best, right? And this is typically how things are operated. But if technology is always a social decision, or should be made a social decision, as opposed to something that other people get to decide for us, then we have to question the predominant role that's given to scientists and scientifically, or in companies that employ many scientists. Anyway, I just want to throw those out as sort of broad issues. There's a scientific technical challenge. What do we do about things like dengue? And then there's a broader and more thorny issue of, and how do we make those decisions, and what's the right way to go? So I think we have a great collection here, because we have a scientist, a public policy person, and a public policy advocate to really bring these forward. So I think maybe just each person can go through and share their reactions. It'd be great to sort of if you have any comments on each other's interventions and so on, and then after that we'll just open up to broader discussion. And then eventually, I guess after this, Tamara's going to come up and Q&A with her, or maybe once it gets to Q&A here, you want to just...
Yeah, then we'll end, and anyone can ask questions that they want. We'll socialize here.
Great, so maybe we'll start with Alex.
Sure, yeah. So, the thing I kept thinking about the film, I spent all day, and really most of the last several months, trying to pass this labeling bill in Albany. Today's a good day, actually. We passed out a committee. We're forever away from actually making it law, so don't get too excited. But I was extremely excited because it took a lot to get it out of the committee. I won't bore you with that, though, but what really struck me was just winning early really matters, right? So the whole basis of this film is, should we be having these genetically engineered mosquitoes or not? And it's interesting to me because that debate is just that's not where the policy debate is on food, right? We've been fighting not about whether we should have genetically modified food, and not even about how we should regulate genetically modified food, but whether we should tell people that they're eating genetically modified food. It just sort of struck me how absurd it is. And organizations like ours, like Food and Water Watch, we've always kind of known that the labeling is sort of what you do when you've lost everything else, right? Like, we fought the approval of these crops, we fought the process they were approved by, we fought all those things. You lose all of that, and then you try to label it. And so I thought it was really striking, but more than that, I thought what was striking about it is, to me, it was kind of a story of how organizing works, right? How really advocating and having a community coming together and saying, we don't want this, that stuff works, right? And you see it over and over and over again. I think it's an important, it's an important thing if you care about GMOs. It's an important thing if you care about sort of policy in America, I think, because it's easy to get very discouraged. It's easy to think that we live in, sort of a corporate state, as perhaps we do. And so I think that knowing that even within that, that this stuff really matters and that local communities can stand up is really important. And you see it all the time, right? We see it on fracking every day, where we kept it out of New York, and town by town we banned it. So you see it all the time, but it was refreshing to me because I think that on mosquitoes, we're just so far away from where we are on crops, and so that was interesting. And it's not just crops. I mean, we're very close to approving a GMO salmon, actually, which is terrifying. There's this sort of general sense people feel, I think, that crops are one thing, but when you start messing with animals, it seems just sort of vaguely creepier, even if you don't quite know why. And so salmon has that too, and you eat it. So to me, it was a really powerful story because it's hard. It's a hard thing to win because no one really cares about mosquitoes, right? Everyone hates them. They sort of only exist to cause disease. Talking to a researcher who work on this issue, actually, and work a little bit, a small part of what Food and Water does on GMO mosquitoes. She said, we've been trying to create a research piece to sort of show why we need them, right? Like why we need mosquitoes. And it's actually hard to find someone who knows because it's difficult to really place why they're important, which doesn't mean we don't know, right? Which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, that there's not some reason and some benefit to the ecosystem, but no one knows what it is. So that's, I think, just really highlights how amazing it is and how great it was that you were able to stand up and Key West was. So maybe I'll stop here and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you and good evening, and thank you, Tamara, for doing this. I think it helps increase the conversation overall that is not happening, generally speaking, about genetic engineering and genetically modified foods. My reaction to the film, in addition to general horror that this could just be even contemplated, that somehow these, monster mosquitoes could be released because we don't know how they will change once they get in the wild. There's so many things we don't know. Is that issue of not knowing, to me, drives this issue of labeling. The bill that I've sponsored in the state legislature in New Jersey is just strictly a consumer affairs bill. It says people should know whether their food has been genetically modified or not because we simply don't know the health impacts or the health effects of having injected these organisms into, blasting it into the cellular structure of our food. And that's because there is no testing longer than 90 days. There has been nothing done that's been peer reviewed. We think that there are health effects that are occurring, but we simply don't know. And to watch, I think it was the CEO of Ossitec talk about, he was so dismissive about this issue of the mosquitoes, right? Like, oh, well, these mosquitoes will just stop producing and that's good. And, there's a lot of others out there, but we don't know whether they'll be affected or not, as if there is no place for them in the food chain. And that lack of knowledge is very disturbing because I would have to guess that some form of insect species are in fact feeding fish and birds that then contribute to the overall environmental biosphere. But people nobody really knows And it has to start with sharing that information and also doing the testing, because if they're not willing to share with us the effects of what happens when the species that is, I guess, sterile or will sterilize out in the natural environment, how do they possibly know that that's going to work? One of the things that I've learned, for instance, about genetically modified food that also gave me great concern about watching this is that it creates, when you genetically modify the cellular structure, it creates new proteins. And those proteins do different things. And nobody really knows what that all means to our human bodies, to our, as we eat these foods. So now you're going to genetically modify the insect. What guarantee is it that they're not going to continue to evolve and change and modify in other ways that could have very disastrous effects? So this issue is not known, and that's the point, right? We need to have a way so that the studies can be done and the information can be shared, so that if there is in fact this long peer-reviewed science that somehow can support this, I think everybody would feel more comfortable with it. And that's the same thing with genetically modified food and the debate that's going on. There may be some benefits out there to the greater society, but why is it that we can't get testing for more than 90 days because the companies hide behind the fact that data is proprietary and that they say it's copyrighted. They say it's material. The FDA says that these foods are materially the same because you can't taste or see the difference. Well, we don't know, and meanwhile we have explosive changes going on with people's allergies and food issues and peanut allergies and all of these things that didn't used to be such a huge factor in society. And the other thing is that, Milo, I certainly agree with you, Alex, to applaud that the activism there, because that does work, but people have to know what they're dealing with. And I think that as soon as it's too many syllables, it's too many words, people don't know what it means, and so finding a way to communicate that this could be impacting their lives is really the challenge, but it always starts with a few concerned citizens standing up and adding their voice to it. That gave me hope that we would be able to answer these questions, and the issue, as you put out, Alex, for food is that it got fought getting to this point, and now all we want is for people to know what they're eating. We just want it labeled. Well, same thing with mosquitoes, right? It's like we want people to know what the risks are so that they can choose to participate or not.
So I appreciate Alex's introduction quite a bit, because one of the things that she said is that I really care very much about public perception about innovative technologies. And along those same lines, my research area has moved from being at the lab bench to science education, because I think, as Alec and Linda's saying, if you want to have public advocacy around anything, whether it's GMOs or a vaccine or a new agricultural practice, it doesn't even have to have anything to do with genetic engineering, you have to be able to make decisions that are based on accurate information. So I think this issue of transparency is very important right now in the United States. There are 14 field trials going on with genetically modified insects, and only 2 of those applications are public. So 12 are not public, which means we don't know where they're happening, we don't know what they are, we don't know and really much about anything on those other 12. And so I think it is very important that there be transparency about where these technologies are going. But I think the other thing I heard was, this notion of biotechnologies, what works and what doesn't work. And one of the things I'm really interested in when it comes to scientific literacy is this discomfort that the public has with uncertainty. So when I hear you, Linda, saying, like, we don't know, you're never gonna know. You're never gonna know. There's always going to be some uncertainty in science. That's actually what science is. It is not a collection of facts. It is actually a process of asking questions and then asking more questions based on new observations. And I think that this is a real challenge in our society because people think science should be a bunch of facts. And it simply is not. And it never will be. So for instance, when we talk about an anti-vaccine movement, which is very strong in this country, that is deeply troubling to me. Because what it's not doing is it's not actually taking into account the balance between benefits and risks. And so I think that when you look at someplace like Key West, where the prevalence of dengue is low right now, there is a threat, and I should point out that that threat is very eminent because of climate change. So when we talk about individuals making choices, it seems that we want to rally very strongly around GMOs, but we don't want to give up our cars, and we don't want to give up our carbon footprint. So these two things to me are intimately linked. If we want to make sure that mosquitoes don't keep going further north, we need to sort of be honest about our practices contributing to climate change. So I think that when we look at the risks in Key West to dengue, and Mel, I think you did such a good job of saying that there's not really a threat. So why this investment? Why this risk? That risk doesn't outweigh any benefit. There's no benefit. But when we talk globally about dengue, that's a whole different story. And I think there, the issue for me is that the Convention on Biological Diversity, through which the protocols on biosafety come out of, they are primarily controlled by governments. So the people, the communities are not part of the conversation. And there's a lot of backlash against the CBD and backlash against the protocols, rightfully so, because they're governments basically making decisions about community practices. So I think it's so important that people be informed and be part of that conversation. It disappoints me greatly that despite the 20 years now of the CBD, like the 14 years from the protocol, we're going on our 11th anniversary, there hasn't been the effort to bring in community in those discussions. So activism is really the only way to foster that change. But that said, if we look at the prevalence of dengue in some communities has escalated 300%. Now, when you're talking about a community that has multiple cycles of dengue, you're talking about a very serious disease, and this can kill a lot of people. The mortality rate is very high for some communities. So it's important for that community to have information and say, well, given our benefits and risks, if we have loss of life to dengue, maybe this is one option we should investigate among many. Not simply the only one, but maybe among many, and then we make the best decision as a community. So my personal stance as a scientist is not to be pro-science, but rather to try to imagine a way that we can promote scientific innovation and scientific interest while supporting what I call the people science, right? Being responsible about the scientific practices that we put forth. And I think that that's challenging given that industry is what's doing the field trial. So the basic scientists are sort of innovating, and then the thing kind of moves into this other space, which is protected, which is not transparent, which doesn't share its results in a peer-reviewed way. And so that's sort of not the nature of what I would call the scientific community. The scientific community is all about sharing your knowledge and being transparent and really being able to stand up and say, my evidence can be repeatable, my evidence is accurate or not, I need to go back and reevaluate my hypothesis. But the other thing I heard you say, and correct me if I heard you wrong, that everybody eats mosquitoes. Right? Something to the effect of like, well, the mosquitoes are disposable and we don't know what role they play in the ecosystem. I would say that there are quite a few ecologists who are looking at the role of mosquitoes in the ecosystem, but I don't know how many of you saw Bill Gates actually posted this infographic on his blog of the mosquito being the most lethal organism on Earth. So I think there is something to be said for the Gates Foundation's involvement in Oxitec's Brazil field trials, for instance. And also I believe that they just passed in Panama as well. So Panama, Brazil, there's several countries now that at least their national governments have decided this is a risk they want to take because of the benefit it could lead to those dengue-ridden countries. I think it's a completely different story here in the United States. But the other thing that I think people tend to do is forget history. So most people don't realize that malaria was endemic in New York City. So it was endemic in New York City until we sprayed the hell out of New York City with DDT, right? So then there was a lot of advocacy against DDT, maybe rightfully so. The problem was people didn't really think about the repercussions of that. So when that advocacy turned into policy, the policy basically made it such that most countries that had heavily burdened malaria were not able to use DDT to control malaria in their communities because they could not receive funding from any organization. So that has been revoked. However, it's a huge bureaucratic mess. You have to go through a lot of emergency claims in order to be able to use DDT. In this country, we don't usually use DDT. In Florida, for instance, they use malathion, which is supposed to be less harmful. But I guess what I'm trying to illustrate in giving all these sort of histories is that it's true we have technologies and we have to make decisions about them, but I also think that sometimes we forget what the alternative is. If you don't use the GMO mosquito and you continue to drive your car and climate change continues to escalate, and now you have diseases moving further and further north, and this is a mobile mosquito that can actually go horizontally as well with chikungunya and many other diseases, at some point there has to be some individual and collective responsibility about what are you going to do? What is going to be okay? Are we going to dredge water? Are we going to change our water practices? Are we going to provide tap water so that people don't have to have standing water, for instance, in Haiti and in Puerto Rico, where there isn't water accessibility for everyone? So to me, it's a systemic change that we have to address, and I completely agree with all the statements that have been said, except I think this notion of uncertainty, people have to get a little bit more comfortable with it. I think if we were to say we have to always know the consequences 20, 40 years out of anything, we wouldn't even be able to use antibiotics and vaccines at all, under any circumstance. You know, even if you're on your deathbed. I agree, we overuse them today. But there are times when it's very important to use these things. And so I have concerns when people say I have to know there's absolutely no risk. I mean, there are very few things in this world for which there's no risk. Walking across the street, you could be hit by a car. So there's always risk, and we just have to be able to evaluate risk with benefit. And I do truly think it's different for different countries and different communities that have different burdens.
I just wanted to jump in on that last point because I had a note here that's almost identical to that. Insofar as, but it cuts in a couple of different ways. Knowledge is inherently open-ended, inherently uncertain, but we have a political system and legal system that doesn't allow for that. Where, back in the 70s, when GMO technology, genetic engineering technology first began to be developed, there was this famous conference in Assemblywoman, California. I think it was in California. Right, and where the adoption of the precautionary principle as a sort of fundamental rule for decision making, where it placed the burden of demonstrating potential consequences on the people who are promoting the change or promoting the technology. And that held for a while, and then, I said this like 20 years ago, so I'm a bit, maybe I should defer to you on this. But hundreds of evidence was showing this stuff is not as risky as was initially thought. But then what ended up happening is things flipped. And it became that it's actually on the burden of people who object to it to prove that it is in fact harmful, right? So what the challenge to the precautionary principle is that, well, it's really slowing things down. And we have, we have a fair amount of confidence, not 100% because you can't have it, but a fair amount of confidence that there's not as much risk as we thought. But that got turned through the legal system and through corporate investment in this into, well, unless you have a smoking gun proving that genetically modified soy is increasing incidence of food allergies, then there's nothing to be done. There's nothing to stop it, right? So that certainty, that demand for certainty, got flipped, and so now we have this sort of debate. Sort of public, demand certainty, and then the corporations demand certainty. But in the middle, it's like, well, we can't have it. So how do we make reasonable decisions based on the information we have available? And it seemed to me, and that the theme running from here is that, well, the way we resolve that is through democracy, through transparency, through democracy, through public debate, and allow people to make informed decisions within the fundamental limitations of our capacity to know. And that ultimately is the threat, because I wonder if there had been initially, and perhaps you can answer this, if there had been a broad public debate and educational campaign, not educational campaign, but here are the issues and here are the challenges, get pros and cons in there and have a debate, and then have people make a decision what might have come about out of this. But when it gets dropped on the public, sort of as a secretive 12 studies, God only knows, right? Well,
Yeah.
what are you supposed to think? So,
There's a reason why it's hidden. That's immediately what you think. There's a reason why they're hiding it. So it doesn't build community trust on any level. But I think to come back to that, in order to have democracy, you also need to have a scientifically literate populace. And we don't. We don't have a scientifically literate populace. So for instance, if you go back to the 1970s and keep going forward, one of the things I hear all the time is, I don't want GMO foods. Okay, fair enough, you don't want GMO foods. But some of the arguments against GMO foods don't actually make any sense. So for instance, the ice minus bacteria, which was genetically engineered to make plants not have frost damage, came under purview, a lot of litigation, a lot of law, a lot of regulation, a lot of tests had to be done. But when the natural mutant was found, and organic farmers used a natural mutant, there was no regulation. And they are genetically identical. So to me, that doesn't make any sense, that you would hold one thing, which is genetically and phenotypically the same as another thing, as different. So the FDA, to some degree, I kind of see sometimes why they say, we're looking at these two things and they're identical. They don't really behave differently in our bodies, in our ecosystems, or anything else. So, again, how long do you want them to do the study? I don't know what would be the right number of years. Would it be 50 years? Would it be 100 years? So at some point there has to be a cutoff for that kind of regulation, and I don't know what's appropriate. But I think if a community wants to come together and try to change that, they have to become scientifically literate. Because to say that changing the DNA of an organism is so drastically awful when it happens all the time through viral exchange, when it happens through natural mutation, that just doesn't hold up in a way that makes sense. I'm not saying it's always like that, but a lot of times it is that way.
Well, I would say, first of all, that the issue of how long is enough, I don't have the answer to that, and nobody's talking about doing 20, 40, or 50-year studies, because right now, the only thing that gets done on genetically modified food is 90 days, because the companies won't permit anybody to study anything longer than 90 days.
Well, the genetically engineered salmon has actually been under study for over 10 years. Over 10 years. So that's a long time.
Studying it in terms of developing it, to me, is different than gathering the data in terms of the effect and impact on human beings and how they are metabolizing it, how they're using that food. Because we don't know with the genetically modified food, especially, as I understand it, and I'm not a scientist, that the substances can continue to evolve. Or even when you have stopped eating genetically modified soy, for instance, that the residue in your gut changes and can evolve and have other effects. So I don't know what the answer is, and I don't pretend to be able to speak to the science, but I understand that believe that there needs to be confidence that there's been sufficient study. I resent deeply that my grandchildren are, in fact, I believe, being part of a large human experiment, because we don't know, and because there are things happening to our kids in terms of their resistances and their allergies. I was saying to Tamara that the way I started to get involved with this whole subject was because one of my grandchildren just simply stopped gaining weight, and the nutritionist said, well, that's what we're starting to see in this generation. These kids are not growing the same way. I don't know what that means, but that's why I look to the scientific community to be able to say, this is a reasonable framework within which we should understand the effects before we go out there and continue to promote this technology as the answer to the future. I mean, one of the things about the Roundup Ready corn was that it was supposed to reduce the amount of the chemicals that were being used. But that hasn't happened, because now we have super weeds, and so we need super chemicals. And And it feels and looks like it's very much being driven by the corporate profits, and that's why they don't want us to know. And that just creates suspicion and concern of enormous proportions that I don't know what the answers are, but I do feel strongly that while everybody's figuring this out and the scientific community is doing the testing and we're gathering data and whatever, people should be able to be informed and be able to make a choice.
Alex, additional comment, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this ends up being chicken and egg thing, right? I mean, I think clearly, I don't think anyone would say we don't need a more scientifically literate populace,
Right.
or perhaps just a more educated population writ large. We do, right? But I also think that under the current process, you could have a scientifically literate population, and what you would get is people saying, well, for a lot of this stuff, we don't really know because a lot of it isn't transparent, it isn't made public, it's not peer reviewed. So when you talk to people who, I like to think I'm somewhat scientifically literate, but we talk to people who are actually scientists, like we do a lot of work with this guy Michael Hansen at Consumers Union, and the sad thing is that the long-term health effects of a lot of stuff you literally just don't know because we're not seeing the studies, and it basically amounts to these companies saying trust us, right? Because they say, look, we've done these studies, but it's not peer reviewed, and you don't need to think these people are evil guys, right? To think that when you're studying something and your company that you work for has a financial incentive and it being safe, it's probably not the least biased study, right? So I think that is a huge, huge problem, and so it's not like if you turn that around tomorrow, everyone would suddenly become scientifically literate, but I actually think it would help, and so then what you end up with, I think, is what you were mentioning, is that you're essentially trying to use democracy, which I think is kind of broken anyway, as a substitute for this stuff. And what you end up with is a pretty weird debate, I think, pretty predictably. And then I guess the last thing I'll mention is just the precautionary principle piece, because I think that's really, really important. And I think it actually is important not just for the way we conduct science and the way we conduct the approvals. I actually think it's infected the way people just think about the debate in sort of their own homes. It's the way legislators think about it, all of that. And I think it's really unfortunate, and it makes it difficult, right? It's hard to organize when, like, the sexiest thing you can say is, we don't know enough, right? People always want to say, like, well, doesn't this give you cancer? Doesn't this do this? And that, the answer is that we have no idea. And that's not a very compelling argument to say, like, we don't know enough about this. And then it infects it all the way down. So, like, at this like totally absurd committee hearing today in Albany, there is a whole debate sort of amongst the committee members in this like tiny room with like 100 people saying no. And the people voting against it were saying, well, look, there are no peer-reviewed studies showing any health impacts of GMO food, so why would we label it? And it's so crazy because instead of proving that this stuff is safe, we're instead saying not only that you have to prove that there's some danger, but that to label it, you have to prove there's some danger. When I have all these lobby meetings and people bring that up to me and I say, look, if there was some peer-reviewed study that this stuff was dangerous, we wouldn't be running a campaign to label it. Like, we would take it off the damn shelves. Like, it's so crazy that that's sort of the level that the debate has gotten to, and I think it's really unfortunate. And I don't really have any answers. I mean, I think broadly you're seeing a big movement around labeling. They passed it in Vermont. I think we're going to see several other states pass it. And I think you're seeing a movement around this stuff in general, but the whole debate is so broken that it is difficult.
Anybody want to step up? I mean, if you have a loud voice, you can probably just speak up. I think there's also a microphone over here. Yes?
Yeah.
What do you think the media tends to get wrong about GMO stories?
GMO what?
GMO stories.
Well, so I saw a paper, it was right before the semester started, and it was a peer-reviewed paper, and it was shit. I mean, really bad. All the figures were bad, the sample sizes didn't make any sense. They actually had 2 figures of the intestines of a mouse, and one was just zoomed in, and the other one wasn't, and so it looked different, but if you actually looked at them at the same magnification, they were identical. I mean, it was just a bad paper, right? And so what ends up happening is some journalist writes about that, and rightfully so. They should be translating that peer-reviewed article for the general public so that the general public has that knowledge. But the problem was that then got picked up by every other blogger under the sun. And so then it was like a trickle effect of like this horrible study that showed that the mouse intestines were, and I'm not saying, I mean, I am not pro-GMO food at all. I'm not. So I just want to be really clear about that. Yeah, I'm not pro-GMO food. I think that we have to be very careful about our biotechnologies, and only in times of very, very great risk, like lives are being lost for some reason. I don't think we need GMO foods. I think we could deal with our food industry in a very different way. But it troubled me deeply that this got picked up by the media and then just like wildfire went everywhere. And there were a few people who then later in the scientific blogs critiqued it, but that didn't get out into the general public. And I actually hold myself responsible because I did write an entry for my own students about why this paper was problematic and how disappointed I was that it almost shot the anti-GMO movement in the foot, because I think there are studies that say there are issues, and so this being a crappy paper just didn't do any goodness to that advocacy. But I thought to myself, you know, where's my social responsibility in helping the communities know what was wrong with this paper? But it's, you know, there's only so many hours in the day, there's so many things you can do. But I think the media does the best job they can do. For every paper that's peer-reviewed that shows that GMOs are good, there's another one that shows that they're bad. My students struggle to make sense of the data. I have colleagues who are, you know, they all have PhDs, they all know science, like you said, and it's very difficult to know which of these studies are really valid and not valid, and it's just complicated, and there's so much industry politics behind the door that there's a lot of bias, and so I don't think it's the media's fault. I just think the media's kind of stuck because they can only communicate what's given in the base primary literature. I don't know what the two of you think about the media.
Well, I think all that is great. I mean, one other thing I'd say is I think that this happens to us fairly often, less on GMOs because the science there I think is more difficult in a lot of ways and more difficult to get covered in a lot of ways. But we also do a lot of work on fracking, and there's sort of a growing literature of health effects of fracking. And what we find when you want to pitch this stuff, you know, to whatever reporter to cover and say like, look, here's this new study, this is what it says. There's a lack of scientific literacy among reporters, which isn't surprising because their readers don't care either. And so they then don't write about that often. And so what you end up having is you have to have everything be as clear as day, right? So what ends up being covered is sort of the simplest conclusion either way, right? Sometimes it works great for us, sometimes it works terribly for whatever given campaign. But that I think is a real problem because it's just not a very fun, like I get why they don't want to write a complicated story. It's harder to write and they know fewer people will read it.
So science is reduced to sound bites.
Yeah,
To Twitter.
Yeah.
and the one other thing, the last thing I'll say about the media is that the other thing that's really not their fault is that there are fewer of them every day and they're posting more because of that. And so I think this is the case of sort of the American worker in general, but if you had some sort of study of the efficiency of American journalists, I feel like it'd be through the roof because they're all posting like 5 times a day, which is a ridiculous way to do journalism, and what you end up with is not that great.
Could you elaborate on the DDT in New York City and how much dengue was there then? And what time?
The DDT at that time was not necessarily for dengue, it was more for malaria. Malaria was endemic all the way up the northern coast.
And the inland, I mean,
Yeah,
I remember
it was
reading
everywhere.
Ithaca, New York.
What
which is really
years
far
was
north.
this?
This was in the early 1900s and then all the way up through post-World War II, I believe, and then it dropped off.
It was
Like
still
the
using
1960s.
DDT until the
60s.
60s, right?
Right, but not in New York City. In New York City, we were able to eliminate the malaria much earlier. But for instance, when we had West Nile virus, we did spray with malathion here, and we continue to spray with malathion here in New York City. And at the beginning when we did it, we did make announcements about we're going to spray in Central Park, we're going to spray in Brooklyn, but there were many communities that said they didn't get the announcement. And so their children are outside, you know, and to me, actually the biggest issue was the occupational health hazard to the workers because they were not adequately trained and they were the ones that were getting the highest exposure on a daily basis to this chemical. And so to me, that kind of training was very, very important, and I don't know that issue. Many of the workers did not necessarily have English as a first language, so even though they were trained in English, they might not have understood all of the protective hazards that they needed to be using, the gloves, the clothing, and so forth. So it's not like New York City is not using chemicals. We do, and one of the things I talked to Alex about was what I find interesting is these very large-scale projects that happen, like the one in Key West, to sort of situate it as an emblematic kind of like case study. Like, look what we can do in Key West. So when malaria was really rampant, one of the places that the Rockefeller Foundation decided to focus on was the island of Sardinia. And I don't know how many of you know this story, but if you ever want to see the movie of the spraying and the dredging of water in Sardinia, it was a humongous workforce effort post-World War. So it was partly to create an economy in Sardinia post-World War II, and it was also to show that with chemical spraying and water dredging, because they knew that the chemical already got rid of the mosquito, but what they said is that we're not getting rid of the larvae, and so we have to do the water dredging and the spraying. And so they employed hundreds and hundreds of men all over the island of Sardinia, and they completely wiped out malaria. And it was heralded as like a really great public health project by the Rockefeller Foundation. And this was before the World Health Organization was sort of the leader in giving out guidelines on health. But what was interesting to me about that is it was a real public health scam. Because if you looked at the cases of malaria in the years prior to that project, they had already dropped from like 3,000 to 138 cases in the year before. So, you know, yes, they were able to eliminate the mosquito and drop malaria down to zero, but going from 138 to zero is, you know, who knows what other things could have been done. I think it was more of a public works project more than anything else to give people an economy. And so I wonder if this Key West thing also doesn't have something about, you know, creating jobs. You know, I really don't know what the other ulterior motives might be, and that's something interesting to think about from the public policy side, is sometimes there are multiple stakeholders sort of pushing things forward.
One of the things in Key West, we don't have dengue. We're free of dengue since 2010. So it's no more to come out with these genetic modified mosquitoes now. And another thing that you can understand as a science is that when you throw those mosquitoes,
you cannot really pick it or bring them back. Just release it into the air, and that's it. And especially the Florida Keys that we have, we are environmental sensitive. We have the largest and the only coral reef in the whole United States, and a lot of fish eating the mosquito larvae. So we're talking about a really sensitive circle. Maybe what you work in one part of the world wasn't in another.
Yeah, we can't hear you, so
Yeah.
let's get that one.